Good afternoon. My name is Tom McIntyre, and I'm the Director of External Affairs at NYU Washington DC. I'm excited to welcome you to today's virtual Salon series, a conversation on the dangers of conflict photography. Today, we welcome our author, Dr. Lauren Walsh. Her incisive new book, Conversations on Conflict Photography, examines the value of documenting war and humanitarian crisis. Lauren, an expert on conflict photography, is a professor and writer. She teaches at the New School and New York University, where she is the director of the Gallatin Photojournalism Lab. She is also the director of Lost Rolls America, a public archive of photography and memory. In conversation, we also welcome Andrea Bruce, an award-winning photographer who has covered events around the globe, and Olivier Laurent, international photo editor at the Washington Post. If you have questions during this webinar that you would like to pose to our panelists, please use the Q&A icon below. Thank you for joining us, and please welcome Lauren.
Hey, Tom, thanks for the introduction. Thank you, of course, to NYU DC Dialogues, and thanks to the audience for zooming in with us. I'm gonna share my screen so we can look at imagery together. Should be up now. And I want to preface by saying, maybe it goes a little bit without saying, given the topic of conflict photography, but I feel better saying it anyway. Some of the images that we'll be looking at today are difficult or upsetting. By way of starting off this conversation, I'm going to moderate, and it'll be a Q&A style with questions to Andrea to hear the photographer's perspective, and questions to Olivier to hear the photo editor's perspective. And by way of starting us off, I want to tell the origin story of my book. It came out at the end of last year, but it goes back a few years. So while I'm speaking, I will show just some of the images that appear in the book. So I'm a professor and I teach courses on photography and ethics. And one particular semester a few years back, I was running a course on conflict photography and ethics. So what does it mean to take a picture of someone else's suffering? And what does it mean to look at a picture of someone else's suffering? So at a particular point in the semester, we were studying the coverage of a famine in Sudan in the early 1990s. And the way that I teach is quite interdisciplinary in scope. So my students were assigned homework that covered the history of what was happening there. They had to learn about the political forces that were shaping the famine. They, of course, looked at the photojournalistic and documentary coverage of the famine, and they read critiques. So it was a pretty rounded take. And then they came into class and we were set to discuss everything that they had looked at and read. And just as I'm doing here with showing images, I do that in the classroom as well. So I loaded up the first image, and it's a photograph that came from their assigned reading. It's a black and white photograph of a man at a feeding center in Sudan, and he's severely emaciated. He's skeletal. And you can understand just how weak he is when you look at the picture, because he's not even standing, he's crawling on the ground. It's one of those photographs that forces you to recognize or think about how dire situations of human suffering can be. And so I put the image up and I was just about to start the class discussion, and one of my students raised his hand and said, "Professor, I understand why you're putting up that picture, but it's such a downer and I have plans tonight. And I don't feel like I should be put in a bad mood by having to look at that image. I have nothing to do with that man's suffering. Why should I care about him?" So for me, this was a stunning moment. It stopped me in my tracks. I'd never heard a student say anything like that before. And I should explain, this is an elective. It's not a required seminar. It's not forced on the students. They know what they're getting into when they elect to be in that class. So, I mean, to my ears, I heard apathy. I heard him saying, "Why should I care about someone else's suffering? And especially, why should I care? I have plans tonight, don't ruin them." So I initially kind of tossed it back to the class without knowing what else to do, and kind of said, "What do the rest of you make of his response? And what do the rest of you make of this image?" And we wound up having a productive class discussion, but I couldn't let the moment go and was thinking about it and thinking about it. And by coincidence, on the way home from teaching that day, I bumped into a friend of mine who is a photographer who has covered conflict around the world. And I told him the anecdote from my classroom. And I fully expected him to say, that's horrible, how terrible, I can't believe your student would say that. And instead what he said was, why are you so surprised? There's nothing provocative about what your student said. Do you have any idea how often I've heard that sentiment? And so at that moment, something clicked, and I thought, well, if that's such a common response, then what's the point? What's the point of taking these pictures? What's the point of distributing these pictures? And so I set out to do a book that answered that question, right? What's the point of conflict photography? And along the way, it folded in a whole lot more, right? The world of contemporary photojournalism, the physical risks that these photographers face, the emotional toll this can take, forces that act as censors, the value of a single image in the age of Instagram, media literacy, visual literacy, a whole lot. And of course, as the professor who's always so interested in ethics, it was a deep exploration of the ethical complexities of this kind of imagery. I decided to structure the book, and this is important for me to explain for our conversation today. I decided to do it as a series of interviews because I wanted to give voice to the people who are making and distributing the images. What is it like behind the lens, or what is it like inside the newsroom? So I interviewed photographers who cover conflict around the world. I interviewed photo editors or heads of photo agencies who are making decisions about which assignments to give, or which images to publish and which ones to hold back. And then I interviewed key figures at human rights and humanitarian organizations, because those organizations are now leading funders of some of this imagery. And then I had a few goals with the book. One of them was diversity. So for those who aren't aware, this is an industry that is historically more male than not and more Western than not. And so with the book, it was very important to me to push back on that. So I interviewed men and women. I interviewed practitioners from Western and non-Western backgrounds, people with 40 years of experience and a rising generation, people who are freelance, people who are staff. And I also took a very broad look at the definition of conflict. So the book covers war zones, but I also step back from the front lines and think about the civilian tolls. As you can see, even with the breadth of images that are moving on the screen now, not all of them necessarily look like conflict. So I was also exploring natural disasters, humanitarian crises, political conflicts, gender conflicts. And for me, I thought about it in a way that echoed my students' behavior. I wanted to think primarily about what does it mean to be an American or a Westerner, and to receive and react to images from quote unquote far away, right? When we're looking at far away suffering. So that's the body of our discussion today. We'll be looking at some of this far away suffering, but we can also, of course, fold in questions about what's happening right here in the United States. We're all bombarded by visuals every single day, and so the book and this discussion today is a chance to slow down and think a little more carefully and critically about some of this imagery. So without further ado, I'm gonna just dive right into the first image. And Andrea, this is gonna be a question for you. I think everyone can see your image on screen. Andrea, of course, is featured in my book. And this is one of the images that is in the book. And the way I talk to you about it in the book, and this is something that I hear from students often, or when I'm giving lectures, I hear this from the public. And it's along these lines, right? I look at this photograph, I personally, I look at it and it's beautiful. It makes me think of a painting. And then I read the caption and it's devastating. And I think for many, there's a dissonance. So why create something beautiful when the subject matter is so horrific? So I think my question to you, Andrea, is, are you thinking about aesthetics and light and framing and composition when you're in these situations, and why?
Thank you, Lauren. Yeah, I get that question as well. I guess one way to think about it is like, what is the alternative? Do we show ugly photos of really like heart-wrenching situations? Does that help the situation at all? Like, we have to document what's happening for people to hopefully get them to change the situation, to help the global community kind of stay aware, to pay attention. and there are a lot of things that we as photographers do to help people pay attention to the world. And one of them is using light composition to draw people's eye into a photo. And this is something that people have done historically for hundreds of years in paintings. Yes, that is the first venue to show world events, was paintings. So if it seems like similar, then it probably is. And in some ways, it can help I think, viewers from across the world go beyond just like their own history. I think in the Western world, one kind of strange impact of this photo is that in the Western world, I think, or in a lot of Christian countries, people are used to a vision of like the Madonna and a baby Jesus in like this type of scene, until you read that this child has died. And it crosses, it made, I think, the community, when this was published on the front page of the New York Times, a very like US-centric community, really relate to a community that's very different, and in a different way. So it was maybe an image that people were familiar with, and this did publish, I think, a couple of days after. And so in a strange way, it also, people relate to another culture in a way they didn't expect. And therefore the reaction to this photo, I think, was very strong. But taking beautiful photos of very hard situations is another way to get people to look at the photo and possibly ask questions and maybe get angry or do something. So that's my take on this.
Thank you.
I think there's also the fact that like a lot of horrible things happen in beautiful settings. Like if you look at the just sunset light that comes in a disaster place, it makes that scene look beautiful. It's like it's not black and white in the sense that like everything is horrible, everything is beautiful. Like there's so many shades of gray that comes in that makes that, yeah, like something you're gonna find like a horrible situation happening in a beautiful setting.
Olivier, you got your photo editor hat on right away. So I shifted to the next screen by way of not actually talking through these two A1s, but giving a kind of foundation for me to ask, can you give us a brief description of what you do as an international photo editor at the Washington Post? And also, I gave in the setup that diversity in the book was crucial to me. And I'm curious to hear how you think about it, right? How diverse is the body of photographers that you work with?
Okay, so the role of a photo editor is basically to partner with our correspondents and writers and editors to find the best way to tell their stories and the stories of the world through photography. So my role is finding the right photos, the right photographers for the stories that we're publishing. There's a sort of sense of the glamorous, like photo editor, like working with photographers all the time. A lot of our work is looking at wires, looking at what AP, Reuters, and AFP have been doing around the news. And I'd say that like about 60% of our job is looking at these. And then you get like the opportunity to work with photographers assigning the right photographers for the stories. So in terms of deciding, making the decisions around who are the photographers that I work with, there's a lot that comes in. Like one is the subject matter. Like what are we covering? How are we going to cover this visually? And who's the best person to do that? I tend to like look for local photographers first. And there's several reasons for that. One is budget, like, like making sure that you spend the money wisely so that you have enough money for the entire year of coverage. Hiring local photographers allow you to save on like flights, for example, for another photographer that comes from another country. And then there's also the fact that with local photographers, you are dealing with people who have an understanding of the society where these events are happening. I'm not saying that this is always a good thing, but it helps in a lot of situations. Being able to understand the subtlety of that culture can be very important in how the story is framed. So yeah, like I try to work with local photographers as much as possible. One thing I have to say, it's also building a relationship of trust with these photographers. I don't want to end up, I don't want to use a photographer I've never used before in a situation that might be dicey. I need to be able to, like when the photographer tells me everything is fine, I need to be able to know if what that person is saying is actually the truth. Because, like we live and we work in an industry where, like this, like it's all about the assignments, it's all about the work that you're doing. And a photographer might be afraid of saying like, oh, this is not going well, I need to pull out, or there's an issue here, because they're afraid that they might lose the next assignment that comes in. So for some situations, I will select a photographer that I have a relationship with, that I know that where that photographer, like when they're going to be in a difficult situation, they will be telling me the truth about being in that situation. Sometimes that means that the local photographer that I've never worked with before will not be the best person for that assignment. But it is my role as a photo editor to build that relationship with these photographers so that I get to the point where I can assign them on even like difficult conflict photography, for example.
And here, of course, is a Washington Post example of a photograph taken in the Philippines, and Hannah Reyes Morales is from the Philippines. Of course, she travels globally documenting as well, but here she is working in a more local setting. Andrea, maybe I had a particular question I wanted to pitch to this image, and maybe I'll make that a part B, but this is you as an outsider, right, going to Iraq and documenting. So do you want to talk about the experience of not being local to a situation and covering it?
Yeah. So, what drew me to go to Iraq and Afghanistan and many other places, but especially those two countries, was since I am from the United States, my country's involvement in those countries to begin with. And I felt like I had a responsibility to document what was happening. And then there are some countries where, I think that especially the Associated Press did a really good job of like encouraging independent journalists in Iraq and Afghanistan. But there wasn't a lot of people who were diving into to cover the events at the time. And as someone from the United States, I could cover some situations easier than local photographers could. I also find it extremely important to really rely on local journalists whenever possible for publications. I think it's really important. And sometimes it is good to have another eye, a foreign eye. I often wish that we had more foreign photographers in the United States to cover things happening here. But I guess when you are a foreigner and you're covering a country, and to be honest, I feel like a foreigner often in much of the United States as well, You know, where you really fit in, or what is your community, is a hard question to ask, and to say that, you know, even where I live right now, am I accepted? It's very, I wouldn't say that that would be completely true either, but that's a bigger question. As a foreigner working in Iraq and Afghanistan, you have to do your best to just make sure you don't rely on cliches. And that means I lived in Iraq and Afghanistan for a while, for several years. I relied on what we call fixers, which are people who make sure that we understand what's happening, people who have a lot of connections in different communities and who can stop me and say, you know, what you think is happening here is not really what's happening here, or give us a more deep insight, introduce us to lots of different people in a community so we can do the best we can with creating a balanced and truthful picture of what's happening. And in some communities, like I worked a lot in Mexico, there, you know, maybe it would have been easier for me to cover certain things than local photographers. And I kind of hate being in that situation, but sometimes it is the case, so.
Yeah, due to some of the risks that a local photographer would be facing. I mean, speaking about risks, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about the image that is on screen is, you had told me that this was during the height of violence and suicide bombings, and I think it's easier, let's say, for the average news consumer to understand that there's physical risks when you're near violence, but what about the emotional tolls? I mean, if you're covering, you know, suicide bombings day after day after day, does it start to take a toll on you?
Absolutely. I think, I mean, to be very honest, I think that journalists who, no matter where they're from, probably especially people who cover their own city or community, suffer emotionally, a huge emotional toll. It's not always as apparent right away. Sometimes it comes out years later, or sometimes it's clouded with drug abuse or alcoholism, or, you know, things that people use to self-medicate. And I think those things are actually quite common in our industry. Especially people who cover things like war. It's hard. It's hard to look at, just like your student said. I mean, my own mother says, you know, that she can't read the newspaper sometimes. And I think as us journalists who are here to witness what's happening so that the world can see it, it's also obviously very, very difficult. I think, I mean, personally, I feel like we just have a responsibility to pay attention to the world, because everything is connected and everything comes back around to every community, no matter where you live, no matter how untouchable it seems, it does come back to you and to your country and your community. But I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and Olivier, maybe you also are thinking about or dealing with emotional tolls. And then this was run by the Washington Post, a picture by Michael Robinson Chavez. And I think this is the kind of imagery that lends itself to someone readily being able to say, oh, the journalist might be in danger, right? Like there's a burning bus, there's a protester holding a stone. If you want to talk about emotional tolls, and then also, are there particular precautions that photographers are taking or should be taking in terms of physical risks, and how do they negotiate that balance between having a job to do and needing to protect, you know, needing to be safe?
Well, like for that last point, I think like it really depends on the photographer. Like it's like not only who they are, but also like the experience that they have in these kind of situations. Like a lot of it is instinct. A lot of it is feeling the situation, feeling when it might turn, and having the common sense to like, okay, this is like, I need to leave right now. But as a photo editor, this is a question that you ask yourself all the time, because we're sending these photographers in these kind of situations. So that's like what I was saying, like just before, like it's knowing the photographer on an intimate level, in a sense, like being able to understand what they are feeling and having them feeling comfortable with you as well to share these feelings, and not be afraid of like, if they like say that something is wrong, that it might jeopardize the next assignment. So as a photo editor, it's walking that fine line and making the photographer feel comfortable. But yeah, it's also like in the decision that you're making on who you're selecting. Like I know that like if I have a story that's about like the Chinese surveillance state, I'm very unlikely to use a Chinese photographer, because that could put them in a very difficult situation with their own government and put them in danger. Like doesn't mean that I'm not going to use Chinese photographers, but I'm going to use them on different kind of stories. One where I know that it's not going to be life-threatening for them. And the same goes for everywhere you are. Like you look at Venezuela, Michael's chance is being able to leave the country after taking these photos. Some Venezuelan photographers might be in a situation where like they don't know what's going to happen to them. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't use them, but it means that we have to take into account every single factor. And thankfully, a lot of these Venezuelan photographers have been able to work in the past few years. But yeah, there's a lot that weighs in when you're like making these decisions.
One of the questions that came in through the Q&A was asking about how do you, as the editor, build trust, or how do you get to that point of confidence in a journalist that you haven't worked with prior?
You start with small assignments. You start with a little assignment and that's not really like, well, the stakes are low. And so you're able to see how they work with you. You're able to see like how they behave on the ground, the feedback from the writers and like, and the feedback with the photographer himself or herself. You know, like if I'm going to hire someone in Nigeria or in Kenya, there are a lot of stories about like the Islamic State in these, especially like in Nigeria, Mali, and like Niger and all this. You start with a little assignment that is about daily life in these countries, and you build up to the point where the relationship and the trust gets you to like where you are able to say, yeah, I won't be afraid for that photographer when they're in that situation, or that I will know what the photographer is feeling when they're in that situation. So that's the role of the photo editor, of like building that relationship and getting that relationship to the point of trust, and being able to talk to the photographer and make the photographer feel comfortable with you as well.
My next question is less about the relationship between the photographer and the editor and more about maybe the photographer's relationship to her subjects, and then also how viewers, their own relationship to the image. So for instance, Andrea, I have this picture here, and an image like this to many people, I mean, we're looking at women and children who are mourning because family members were killed. And it strikes many people as deeply invasive, right? You're there, you took out your camera, this is their worst moment. How do you respond to that, or explain that? Are you being invasive?
Well, I think that every situation is different. And as a photographer, you have to, know that I was accepted. I through a translator, came to the scene, explained truthfully who I was and who I worked for. and was witnessing things as they unfolded the morning after family members were killed. And I think in different cultures, how people express grief is different, and it's not shameful. You know, I often find it strange in the United States that people hide their grief. And in a lot of, or probably most of countries that I've been to, most cultures I've been to, I think grief is simply a showing of how much someone loves someone and misses them. And so, you know, photographing that is not something that I shy away from, and it's something that I celebrate. I actually find, this is going to seem weird, but funeral photography to be something that I find really important and beautiful, and I really love it. But at the same time, I make sure that I'm welcome there. I don't, you know, push myself and my camera into places where people don't want me. So that's always established while I'm there.
And this next image kind of maybe grows on the heels from the last. And I can pitch this as a question to both of you. I mean, Andrea, you can respond first because it's your photo, but Olivia, I think you'll have thoughts on this as well. On the one hand, I'm looking at a photograph of a mother and two children, right? On the other hand, this is also conflict photography, at least how I've defined it in my book. This is a story of and connected to conflict. So I would be curious to hear from both of you, Andrea first, about what's the value of documenting or showing the civilian experience of or in the wake of war?
Well, I think it's probably the most important part of covering a war zone, because this is how most people live through it, but also how different cultures see a community. So what I think a lot of people, when they think of a war or a country that is riddled with war, they think of a very specific photo of like violence and military, and that photo can become old or predictable to them. And I think, especially when I was in Iraq, I wanted to show different points of view, and following Hala for a year was really important to me, to show like how this one woman, her whole life changed in a different way. She, like many women in war zones, had to rely on prostitution to survive for her children, and that's an important point of view. No one is less significant, you know, than another, and hearing a woman's voice was much needed at the time, and still is always. But even then, I think you hear in war zones the voices of many men most of the time, and you don't really hear from women. So yeah, and so I think showing daily life so that people don't have one stereotypical view of what life looks like in a country is also important. And that's the civilian or human side to everything.
I agree with Andrea in the sense that, like, there's a fascination in our industry for conflict photography, but this is just a small part of what this is all about. Like, photography is about showing every single aspect of life. It's showing the sad moments, the war, it's showing the happy moments of daily lives, the normalcy of it. Take the example of, like, I signed a photographer 2 years ago to Yemen, and you can decide to do a story about Yemen that is just focused on the frail bodies of people dying of hunger, or you can show the daily life of that country that explain, that contextualize that hunger. the fact that like one of the photos of like by that photographer in Yemen, Lorenzo Tignoli, was of a woman begging outside the market. And the market was plentiful with vegetables and fruits. And the side story to that was the fact that the hunger doesn't exist because there's no food. The hunger exists because the war has prevented like the normal amount of food of coming in, and now the food is just too expensive for that population. So there's so many aspects of war that is not just a conflict photo, that is not just a battle photo. There's so many stories of the effect of war on people that need to be documented.
And that's one of the points that I hope came through, at least it's definitely in the book, and I hope came through with that opening slideshow of images where the vast majority of them are not soldiers and combatants or dead bodies.
But we see so many young photographers who believe that they need to be on the front lines to have a career, and it's sad like that in 2020 we still have to have these discussions with some young photographers who've never been outside of their country who want to go to a war zone.
Yeah, and we have plenty to document right here, but we'll come to that shortly. So I have this image up, not by way of specifically discussing Jamal Khashoggi. I just, we all know this case, and it is horrific and representative of a greater sense of risk and harassment and threats against journalists and journalism. So Olivia, I can let you start out with this one. I mean, do you feel that, let's say, journalism as an institution is under threat or under pressure? And then a specific question that came in through the Q&A was asking if specifically any Washington Post photographers or any photographers that you've worked with have been hurt while on assignment.
So far it hasn't happened to me, thank God. But yes, this is, you know, like you hear the stories from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s and 90s where there was a recognition of the essential role of the press, of the essential role of photographers, where there was a sort of idea that they weren't, that like they were more secured in being recognized as an essential part of the story. Today, it's like you never know what's going to happen to a journalist. You never know what could go wrong. So you have to ask yourself these questions when you're a photo editor, like what could go wrong? What can happen to a photographer and to a journalist when they're in a particular situation? This sort of journalists are seen as target in some countries, in some regions of the world, and in some even when you're looking at the political debate in the US, a lot of people are angry at journalists as well. So you don't know what could happen on a national, local story as well.
Even just to the audience member who asked that question, that was also a question that I asked of various of the photo editors interviewed in the book, and at least two of them walk through situations where a journalist working under them, a photographer working under them, was severely wounded or killed. And so they're distressing, but they're very important stories. And actually one of the photographers in my book, I did the interview and the book wasn't yet out, and he's a Shahidul Alam in Bangladesh, and he gave a Facebook Live interview where he criticized the Bangladesh government and then was picked up in the middle of that same night, carted off to jail, tortured, held without being told what the charges were. I mean, it was a terrifying situation, and thankfully he is okay now, but he also, that's addressed as well in the book. Andrea, have you faced situations of harassment because you are a journalist?
I mean, different levels of harassment, nothing as extreme as what you're mentioning now, but there's definitely a sense of like, you know, either people want to shoot the messenger because we are the ones showing what's really happening, and like all these pictures that we're showing, these are not things that we create. These are situations we simply are witnessing. We don't change the environment. We don't, you know, change the lighting. We don't do things in these, you know, documentary images that are, you know, what we want to exist in the world. But also, for instance, with the U.S. military, there's a lot of, you know, I could go to one. I could be embedded with one group, and if people, you know, everyone there would say basically, you know, if you even photograph a hangnail of one of our soldiers, then you're out of here. And I would leave on my own because that's not a situation that I want to be in to photograph, you know. And then I would go to another, you know, division or even just a little squad, and they would say, please photograph everything, because, you know, what we photograph, you know, if it shows up in the Washington Post, the president will see this or Congress will see this, and we need more, you know, up our vehicles, more gear, we need this, you know. And so if we are dying, you know, we want you to photograph this. And so I mean, I find some censorship in some cases and some hostility. Being a woman sometimes can put me in danger also, but not as often as being a journalist, that's for sure.
It sort of reminds me of after Shahidul Alam was released, and I wound up quoting this line in the book because I found it very powerful. He said, "The only crime I can be accused of having committed is the crime of journalism." This next image, it's one of those images I had in mind when I prefaced by saying there'll be some difficult photos. It's a photograph from Yemen, and Olivia, you touched on Yemen before, and it did run in the Post. And you know, I'm curious to hear from the editor's perspective, doesn't have to be specific to this image, but just in a more general sense, what is the value of sometimes upsetting the public a little bit or showing something graphic? And are there things that are too graphic?
These things are happening. And this is, it's a simple answer, but we're in the business of showing what's happening in the world. So yes, there are moments, there are photos that might be too graphic. If there's always like walking that fine line in showing the horrific nature of an event without it being too horrific to show. You know, there's a difference between showing like the consequences of a bombing and showing like completely dismembered limbs on the street. Like, you have to find the right way of showing that for the audience that you're dealing with as well. When you look at this photo of Yemen, I mean, this is happening. This kid is having trouble breathing, and that photo is a good depiction of the situation in that hospital. Then it's how, as a photo editor, you contextualize that photo, how you present it to the audience. That's very important. Is it a photo that should end up on A1, for example, on the cover page of the newspaper? You have to ask yourself that question, and how you're going to present it. And this photo particularly, like, was not on A1, was inside the paper. And the photo that was on A1 was like of a kid in Yemen, but like where there was a more subtlety to the image.
I think it's actually the A1 we had up earlier on the screen, and
Yeah.
it's not as clear exactly what you're looking at.
Yeah.
I did want to, I'm going to shift very shortly into the questions that are coming in from the audience, but I did want to say, my book, of course, focuses on conflict, even if defined very broadly, but neither Andrea nor Olivier is defined by conflict, right? They're doing other work. So I just wanted to show that as well. Andrea, you have this wonderful project called Our Democracy, and I don't know if you wanted to maybe just give a few sentences on this project.
Sure. Well, covering war and conflict overseas, and in a lot of places where the U.S. has kind of encouraged the idea of democracy or fought for democracy in different countries, I thought it would be good to see what democracy means to people in the United States. So for the past few years, I've been traveling around the United States, asking people what democracy means to them. And the answers are very diverse, very, very different from place to place. And I've also tried to encourage involving the communities more. I feel like journalism is a hard thing these days, and that there's somewhat of a disconnect, especially in the United States, between journalists and the public, and maybe we get it wrong sometimes. So maybe it's best to go to a place and really act again like I am a foreigner, and try to do my best to get the story right before I dive into what the story is. I feel like we try, very hard to do that overseas, and maybe we don't do that well enough in our own backyard. So a lot of that is about, going and asking, and I've had democracy dinners where I ask people what they think this word means. We've had discussions with different communities without even using the word democracy to get at where people have power in their communities, and also what the story is in their community. So they kind of direct me and tell me, and actually have clued me into a lot of things I had wrong about, or misconceptions I had within the United States, or things that are more complicated. Everything is more complicated than we think, no matter where we are. So seeing a more clear picture of what's happening in the United States, which is, I think, even now more important with what we're going through at the moment. So I'm going to continue to work on this project on democracy and what we think this means, and where the inequalities exist, and what that means for the word democracy for different communities across the United States. So yeah, this is my ongoing project, which is big and very different for me. So we'll keep you updated.
Everyone can check it out. It's called Our Democracy. And you referenced what we're going through right now, which I think had a larger, bigger kind of political attention to it, but also what we're going through right now is the pandemic. And I just wanted to, I guess, I don't know, give a sort of shout out to this, that not all of the imagery that's being published is hospitals and stretchers and face masks. I found this such a beautiful piece, and Olivier was one of the editors on it. And it was just another way of looking at the pandemic, or making us feel that kind of connection of, I'm experiencing that too. But specific to the pandemic, Olivier, we got a question that actually came in even before the session began, and I have it here. I'm going to read it to you. How do you think the pandemic will affect travel and access to conflict regions? Do you think it'll become harder to enter such regions in the future? Are you afraid that the pandemic will be used as an excuse to keep journalists and photographers away?
We don't know. And that's the thing about this pandemic, is that it's an event that, like, nothing similar has ever happened in the modern era. We do not know what's going to happen after this. Like, there's so many aspects of daily life that are completely changed by this. And photography is going to be changed by this in some way as well. Whether it's like on access, no idea. Like, you know, like right now, like going into half of the countries around the world is impossible. I'm sure some government somewhere will be like, yeah, this is an excuse. We're afraid of foreigners bringing the coronavirus back. You're not allowed in. I'm sure there will be some countries that use that. It will be interesting to see what happens, and it will be interesting to see how it's going to affect photography and photojournalism in general.
Okay, so I'm gonna try to get through as many of the questions that are coming in as possible. I'm gonna bundle two together and pitch these to Andrea. Has there ever been a moment where you have not taken the picture, or you have taken it but then never published it or never submitted it or never filed it? Is part one. And part two is, have you faced, I think you touched on this a bit, but if you want to elaborate, difficulties, particularly as a woman in this industry?
Okay, those are two big questions.
Yes.
So as a woman, I mean, yeah, different situations, people are more friendly towards women than others, but I think as a whole, as a photographer in the field, I've experienced more, I've actually had more access. I think I've had more access to women, which at least half the story everywhere you go. So I think that in a way that balances out. I think in the industry, it's sometimes harder to be a woman, but hopefully that's changing. So I'm optimistic about that. And the first question was about, sorry, that led me down that.
It was, have you ever not taken an image, or if having taken it, have you ever kind of then held it back from public eyes?
Yes, of course. There are certain circumstances as a photographer that you go into and you realize that it's a made for media event. So I'd say, like, sometimes you go to a rally and you realize that people are just reacting for a camera, burning a flag or being dramatic or being violent. And I turn away from those events. I realize that it's not real, really. It's to make, it's like a weird PR thing. So there's that. There's also cases where, like Laurent talked about, where I've maybe been forced to photograph very gruesome things, very like body parts or something that no, I wouldn't send in because people can't relate to something like that. I think in order to get people to relate to other people, you have to show the human impact and the humanity behind a situation. So I think sometimes when a lot of the situations I have been in have become too gruesome, I've looked for other ways to illustrate that, either through the sadness of funerals or people who have lost the people they have lost. So yeah.
And then I'm not sure we'll wind up getting through all the questions, but let me just try to get to one more. And Olivier, this is not a small question, but it's a very important one. The asker was responding to the fact that you said we're there to show you what's really happening. And the question is, but is there a double standard when it comes to looking at American suffering and pain and grief versus quote unquote far away? We don't see this as often in an American context, except perhaps in lower socioeconomic situations. So I'd like to hear you respond to, is there a double standard?
Yes, there is, but you have to ask yourself the question, is it a double standard in journalism, or is it a cultural, societal double standard? Andrea like mentioned this, like where in a lot of countries where like grief is shown in a much more public way than it is in European or American societies. You look at like what's going on with the pandemic right now. We see a lot more photos of inside hospitals in foreign countries than in American hospital. And one of the reasons for that is privacy as well. Privacy laws that like our country might have that other countries might not have. Or like different cultural element where people are more open about death or more open about their privacy in different cultures. So there's a lot, like there is a double standard where we should be seeing a lot more images, more graphic images in Western societies than we are, but that's also because there is, I don't want to say rules, but there's a sense of expectation that has happened over time where like we used to see a lot more graphic photos in the past from the US and from Europe, for example, than we are now. And that's because society has evolved and what they accept and don't accept being portrayed. You have to ask, when you ask that question, you have to ask, what would you do if it were you in that photo? Would you want to be photographed in that way? And so, yeah, like the answer is very different in different cultures.
Andrea, is there anything you would want to add to that one?
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. It's different in different cultures. I do wonder if photographers are more sensitive sometimes in their own communities than they are in other ones, and I think that's something that we should look at critically, always, you know, continually. But I think we should also ask that question to society as a whole, like why are we scared to show like pain and suffering in our own community? Do people think that shows a weakness or something, or, you know, or is it a celebration of love and respect to acknowledge that this person existed, this person died, and I want to know why, or I want this to change for others. Like, I feel like empowering people to realize that journalism is there to help, not to point fingers or point out weaknesses, is important. Like we risk our lives and try to bring truth to the public view because we care, not because we're trying to bring people down.
I feel like that's like a perfect, I have to like, with like 1.5 minutes to go. Yeah, I mean, I want to thank both of the panelists, Olivier and Andrea. To those of you who asked questions that we didn't get to, I'm sorry. I mean, one thing I will say is all of the questions that came in, all of them are addressed in the book, right? So it'll be through not necessarily Andrea and not Olivier, but through other voices and other perspectives, your questions are tackled. And I think one note that I just want to end on is, you know, I think images are as dominant a mode of communication as the written word. I think we speak with images, we learn with images, we see with images. And so to me, the smarter we can be as consumers of news imagery, the better it is for all of us, right? Journalism, as Andrea said, is the kind of bedrock of our country. It's a bedrock of a democracy. And I think we can push journalism to always be better by having these critical conversations and thinking through images in the way Olivier and Andrea just helped us. So I think, I don't know, Andrea, Olivier, do you have any final thoughts? Otherwise, I think it's kind of a thank you to both of you. Thank you to the audience. Anyone wants to get the book, it's available. Yeah, any final words?
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Olivier. It's good to see both of you.
Same here, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.